They might overpay to land talent to bring them in versus where they maybe need to pay just to land the talent. They'll do those things and it will work and it's going to attract the talent. The play is really on the equity side, right? But no one wants to take a base salary reduction. So they end up doubling up because they get the same at least base salary as where they were before with this big equity load.
You're listening to Talent Therapy. Here, you'll find discussions with biotech and pharma leaders around talent and recruiting trends, market insights, and leadership philosophies so that you and your team are informed around an array of industry perspectives. And now, your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Jason Toothaker, welcome to Talent Therapy. How are you this morning?
I'm good, Chris. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited about this conversation. It's a little bit of a tangent, but a very relevant tangent for the guests that I typically have on, which are usually centered around talent acquisition and other types of leadership within biotech and pharma. But your background is in compensation, which is a really critical part of our industry. So I think it would be fantastic for you to introduce yourself, discuss your background, and kind of go through your career path and talk about your business.
Yeah, no, thank you. First off, thanks for the opportunity to come and talk with you. I really appreciate it. Really, the background, I started in public accounting out of college with PricewaterhouseCoopers, started the audit side of the business, spent about 5 years there before transitioning into HR, really, and campus recruiting. And from there, that was kind of my shift from kind of the business side to the HR side. From there, rolled into a compensation role at a company called Biotech Technologies, right? That was kind of an up-and-coming technology company in Cambridge. Unfortunately, I was there in 2007 when Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis hit. And so at that time, no one was recruiting. And so my boss asked me to slide over into a compensation role under a gentleman named Gene Baker, who has since become kind of a career mentor to me. And that's kind of really how I first started getting into compensation. Rolled into a couple different roles and then ultimately to Biogen, where I spent about 7 years. And the last few years headed up global compensation at Biogen, right? So 8,800 people, 35 countries. Great experience, learned a lot of great things there, met a lot of great people, and then was looking to really make the next step in my career into total rewards, right? So kind of moving from just owning compensation to owning benefits, compensation, and executive compensation. Got my first opportunity at a company called Abiomed, was there, learned a lot of great things, really went deep on the sides that I wasn't as strong on to learn as much as I could, as quickly as I could. And then ultimately to a company called Acceleron Pharma. And that really, I think, I always say that if someone has one company that's their company in their career, Acceleron was my company, right? I think the leadership team, the HR team, the growth and development that I had when I came on board, we were 225 people or so. When I left, we were 450 people operating in 3 countries before we were ultimately bought by Merck. So then once we were bought by Merck, I started trying to find another kind of Acceleron. I really loved it, right? Because I went from driving a process and business at Biogen that was already in place and just maintaining it to actually building out the comp and benefit platforms in Switzerland and Germany and Canada and so forth, right? And really found a lot of growth and enjoyment and impact out of that. Tried to find another Acceleron. I think, I was at the VP of Total Rewards level at that point. And kind of kept getting the same answer, right? Hey, we really like you, but we're only 150 people. We can't afford a VP of Total Rewards. So made one other stop at a company called Valo Health. And the primary purpose there was to try to help them go from being privately owned to publicly owned, which is something I hadn't had experience with at that time. Again, the financial economic impacts continue to kind of play out. That company started to downsize. And I went to the CFO, Graham Bell, who he and I became very close and said, Graham, look, there's one of two options here. You either want me to step up into the head of HR role, which I can promise you no one wants, or I think there's an opportunity for me to play in the space that I want on a fractional consulting basis, right? He loved the idea. He said, we're your first client. I'll let you start to kind of build up a client base before we kind of shift you out. And that gave me a perfect opportunity in December of 2022 to go out and start consulting on my own, right? So that was about 3.5 years ago. And 3.5 years later, we're engaged with over 40 small to mid-sized biotech companies.
That's quite the adventure. Yeah. I mean, I think that from my understanding, the comp expertise within life sciences is pretty small. There's probably not a lot of people that do what you do. There are people that do it, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure 99% of them are focused on working full-time at a biotech or a pharma company. And with your background, it sounds like you're really interested in starting something up from kind of scratch, which goes back to your Acceleron days, right? Something that you are proud of and that you kind of built from the ground up. And then that, that shows some sort of entrepreneurial spirit. And then to be at the point you're at now, to start your own business, I think it's a unique career path for a compensation person. You're the only person I've ever known who's done that. I'm sure there are others, but kind of a cool story.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that's kind of part of what's made things go so successful. I mean, when I first started it, it was more of, hey, can I keep the lights on in doing this, right? And you almost never say no because you don't know what the next client's coming. But I think very quickly, I would say a year and a half in, I really saw that there was an opportunity. One of the things I didn't talk about is I've got a team of 5 other professionals that support all of our clients' needs, right? So I have a data manager that really takes care of all of our tools, templates, data files, analysis, modeling, all of those things, who is phenomenal. Like, he's really good. I have another woman that's an HR ops benefits person, a total rewards associate, a project manager, and actually a payroll consultant that sometimes will step into clients if they're having trouble with payroll. But I think quickly on, I think people started to realize, I think sometimes when people want to engage with consultants, one of the challenges is are they going to be there for me 3 months down the road, right? Hey, I like this person, they seem really good, but I know that they're looking for full-time opportunities, right? So if I engage with them and I have a need that I'm going to drive my objectives, are they going to be here? And I think quickly I learned that this is where I want to be. This is what I want to do. I've received a number of calls from external recruiters trying to go back in-house, and the answer is the same each time, right? I think people see that, they get it, and that gives them the sense of security that we're here for them and we're going to be there for them.
Yeah. Those external recruiters reaching out all the time, man. Those guys.
Cause nothing but trouble.
You mentioned something about the time that you went off on your own, which was pretty close to the time that I went off on my own, but you actually went off a little later in December of 22. That was not a great time to go off on your own for a biotech related startup, but you've grown substantially since then. Do you think that was because there was probably more of a focus at that time on where capital was being spent and allocated, and so they really wanted to kind of buckle down on compensation? It just kind of dawned on me as you mentioned December of 22.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great point. I mean, here's what I think. I mean, each year I seem to understand it and get a better feel for it. I mean, I think because of what you just talked about, people were less likely to have a headcount for a director of total rewards or a senior director of total rewards or whatever they may have had. Their headcount came down. And, when people think about growing or they think about where they're at, it's obviously HR is the first priority, right? HR ops to take care of some of the administration stuff, and then usually recruiting, and then comp, and then L&D, and then performance. Those roles kind of follow on. So I actually think it kind of helped in that people didn't have the headcount for a total rewards person, but they had the need. And, one of the things that I say to a lot of folks when I'm talking with them about, kind of coming on board or engaging with them is I think that there's 3 spots that we fit really well into, right? I've got CHROs that come to me and say, Jason, I know what I want to do. I've been there, I've done that, but putting out fights between my executive leadership team and I just don't have time to do it, right? Can you come in, build out the comp infrastructure, take a look at benefits, help me on the executive comp side, and really be that arm that I need. And so that's one spot. I think the second spot is that we've got new CHROs that may have come from a bigger company, Sanofi, Merck, BMS, Biogen, and they were VPs of HR before. They're now a new CHRO owning the executive leadership team, and they come and say, hey, look, I've got a pretty good handle on comp, and I think I know what I want to do, but I used to have a comp team behind me to do everything, right? I now don't have anyone. Can you come and just kind of maybe help, provide some over-the-shoulder guidance, guide me where I may not be thinking about some things and put some things in place, right? So that's the second place that we fit well into. And then the third is I've got folks that come and say, hey, look, I've got a great associate director of total rewards, right? But he or she has primarily focused on the benefit side. They don't know comp. They don't know executive comp. Can you come in, put it in place, help coach and develop them up? I think at the end of the day, I think, look, for a 200-person, 225-person company that's looking to bring in a director of total rewards, I think there's a few things that come into play, right? I think number one, there's not a ton of them out there. And I think people see that and realize it, right? And so who you bring in is a little bit of a roll of the dice as to whether they actually can deliver on the strategy, operationalizing it, and delivering what you need. So that's a little bit of a question mark. And then number two, that's ultimately, all in probably a $400,000 to $450,000 job, including benefits, right? I think where me and my team have come in and fit really well into is we can do everything that they want from the beginning of the year through the end of the year with any process that they need for probably a fraction of that cost, right? Maybe half or even less than half, depending on what they want. And, I like to think that we deliver it in a way that meets or exceeds their needs and gives them the tools and templates to learn and operate on their own. And so the tools and templates that we've built out over the past 3 years, I think are second to none, right? It really delivers the client the ability to operate without a lot of back and forth on their own. And sometimes I do have clients that, will pop in every couple months. Hey, Jason, can you just take a look at this one SVP offer, right? I'm not really sure where I want to follow this. Give me some thoughts. But yeah, so to go back to your point, December 2022 was a really weird time. But I think from a consulting standpoint, it actually helped me take off.
Yeah, makes sense because there wasn't the need for a full-time resource, but if they could have a expert on a kind of as needed, a fractional type basis, perfect.
That's right.
Especially since of all the attention that was being put on spend at that point.
That's right. Yeah.
So fast forward to today, 2026, what would you say the biggest, and I know you started to touch on this a little bit, but what would you say some of the biggest challenges are that small and mid-sized biotechs face within comp today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I see is like to first paint the scenario, right? You've got small to mid-sized biotech companies who many of their equity is depressed, right? A lot of the equity grants that they've given folks is underwater. They have their annual objectives. Sometimes they're meeting it and paying out bonuses at 100%. Sometimes it's a little less. Sometimes maybe it's a little more. And then you've got pay equity things on the salary side, right? And so when you take a look at those three pieces, where I see people really struggling is how do you recognize performance? How do you pay for performance, right? You've got some levers that are available to you, but if your equity is underwater and people aren't placing the right value on that, if you're missing your bonus targets and you're not paying out where you need to on that, and you don't have the ability to pay people more for their performance, and based on pay equity changes in laws, it's awfully tough to differentiate on base salary. People are kind of stuck, right? So I always talk about levers, right? You've got base salary, bonus, equity, and then promotions and adjustments, right? So in those scenarios, I think the challenging part that I see is the only lever that a manager really truly has in some of these companies to pull to recognize performance is the promotion lever, right? Because that's the only thing I can really dictate and control, right? And the challenge with that is that, I've started finding, the average person's being promoted 1.5 to every 2 years, which means, ultimately, if that continues, your company's promoting, 50% of their organization each year, essentially, right? And it's number one, it's just not sustainable from a cost standpoint, right? Number two, people that progress that fast in their career starts to create inequities with other people that are there, right? So if I'm a director of, FP&A, and I look over at my world and I know I own all this and it's got a global remit and I've got 3 direct reports, and I look over at a director of regulatory, right? And that's not a great scenario, but if their world is smaller, things start to erode and fall apart. What we try to put in place is a career architecture, a broad career architecture of what each kind of level dictates in the external market, so that you're hinged on that, right? In that a director is a director regardless of the function that they operate on. And that's kind of your baseline, right? And, I think you got to push back on leaders and business managers to say, what about their job has fundamentally changed? I know why you're doing this because I've taken away all of your other levers, but what about their job has fundamentally changed this year versus last year? And that's the big question that people, I think, are kind of looking over and just continuing to promote. One of the things that we do for our clients is we help them kind of assess, if you were to put in performance multipliers on the bonus side, how much of an additional cost would that be, right? And so we model out, hey, if you had 25% of your organization receive 25% more on the bonus payout, how much would that cost the company, right? And usually that's about 2 to 3% of your total bonus payout. And so we start there and say, okay, is that something that the CEO can approve? Can we go get a discretionary pool approved by the comp committee? But usually it's anywhere from, a lot of my clients, it could be anywhere as low as $75,000 to as high as $3,000. But when you have the conversation with the compensation committee, they're generally willing to kind of release those funds to pay for performance, to keep those top performers and keep things going. People gotta know that. And then when you do introduce it, you now have added a second lever. So now if I'm a manager and I've got someone that's doing great, their job may not have changed, so I'm not going to just go promote them. I'm going to give them that performance multiplier and pay them out a bit more the following year. And so I think, that's something that something I see companies struggle with. And when it does get to a point, you've got a much bigger issue 2 or 3 years down the road by operating that way that you then need to clean up.
Yeah, that's something. It's a really interesting point because I do see that a lot. Like in my role, I'm talking to candidates all day, and I see the speed at which promotions are happening compared to how they used to happen, because it's much quicker now than it used to be. And I sit here and say to myself, and I think a lot of recruiters say this, like, this could kind of be an issue, or it is an issue sometimes, because you're working with a hiring team and they have a certain expectation of how many years this person should have, and they want to bring them on, let's call it the director level. But people that experience are executive directors, and you're like, okay, it can become a problem. It can become a problem, and it kind of is a problem. The whole idea of ingraining performance multipliers to keep people engaged, but not set off the whole leveling structure of your organization, is a really interesting, nice idea.
Yeah.
But I think, to your point, the default is just promote them. It's been 1.5 years, 2 years. We want to keep them. They're great. Let's give them a title bump from director to senior director, give them a pay bump. And then if they go somewhere else because the company had to have a layoff, it creates this very complicated dynamic.
Yeah.
And I've actually seen it come back a little bit, where people might be willing to do a lateral move, or sometimes even a step down title-wise with a comparable compensation package. But it's not an ideal dynamic.
Yeah, no, it's not. And I mean, I think, every pay action or pay decision that I make, right, I'm trying to look 2 or 3 years down the road and saying, hey, if we make this decision right now, where does that place the business leader or the business manager in managing this talent so that they're successful? They're aligned to the role that they should be in, operating effectively at that level for 2 to 3 years. And if we can do that and then have an opportunity to promote them there, we'll put ourselves in a position to effectively manage someone's career growth and development for a 4 or 5 year period. I think in today's day and age, with as much as people move companies and move around, if I feel like we made the best decision to get 4 to 5 good years, I think that's a win all day long. Anything beyond that is great.
Yeah, I agree. With your current clients, like, what are the typical external market data sources that they're using? And then also, what are the biggest challenges that your clients deal with as it relates to some of those external market data resources? Love to hear about that.
Yeah, no. So I think, in our space, small to mid-size, right? And I think, we generally focus on clients that are anywhere from kind of, 35, 40 employees and, as large as 750 employees generally, right? That's kind of the companies that we focus on. Almost everyone utilizes Aon Radford in the biotech pharma space, right? That's where all the peers are. That's where all the are. They've got all the data they need. And so almost everyone participates, at least with Radford. I've got some clients that have kind of piggybacked up on Radford, and they'll use Willis Towers Watson internationally, right? Because Europe, Willis Towers Watson is probably a more prevalent source of data on the compensation side in Germany, Switzerland, France, Spain, things like that, because they have the bigger companies, right? The bigger companies are usually with Willis Towers Watson, the conglomerate biotech pharma companies. I've got a few that occasionally use Mercer as well, but those are the primary data sources that we see and that we use. And that's because that's what our peer companies in our competition is. When I think about, some of the challenges, the data is the data, right? I always say that's kind of one element of the equation, right? You've got external market data. You've got where you're paying your folks, so your internal peers and your internal comparisons. And then you got what your recruiting team is telling you as far as what salaries are with qualified candidates that we're talking to. Those are all through. I think when you think about the data, in my team, we live in the data, unfortunately, and we're in it week to week, day to day. For you to really create designs and programs, you have to understand how the data changes, why it changes. If salary increases at 3.5% every year, does that mean that the data changes 3.5%? No. What we generally find is that the data might shift 1.8 to kind of 2% each year. And so knowing that, you can then kind of make better decisions around where you want to place people in their competitive range, or to the market 50th, or whatever it is that you're targeting. There's also a bunch of other nuanced kind of scenarios too that we help clients with, in that, Radford doesn't have an executive director level. Okay, well, how do we approach that so we can operationalize it and build a methodology around it? They don't have senior manager. How can we do the same thing there? You know, every single year, whenever I get new data sets for each client, I'll do a comparison around what jobs have changed the most. And every year we'll see, and within the whole data set, we'll see almost over 100 jobs that change by more than 5%, right? So you have to go through and say, does this make sense? Should this role have changed? Is there something about this role that means we have to pay 5% more this year than we did last year, right? If not, you got to make some trade-off decisions. Also, some people I think will use the 25th and the 75th and make decisions based on that. Some of the challenges are that 25th and the 75th don't always work relatively like you might want them to, right? So I can't tell you how many times I've seen, a market 50th of $200,000. The 25th is 198. Right. And then the 75th is 260. If your methodology and design is built on using the 25th and 75th to place people, it's going to fundamentally break down. What other alternatives or approaches can you use that are going to put you in a more effective position to make intentional, consistent decisions? Right. I think that's the key. And then the last one that I see is within the scientific jobs. If you take one scientific area and you look at the job focuses of those scientists within that same level, you'll see a really wide kind of spread and gap between those different roles. And is that really how you think about, say, scientists too, that you want them being paid fairly significantly differently? Or do you see a scientist two being a scientist two and with one rate of pay with a little variation, but based on what they do, but you're driving that versus the data driving. And so those are a lot of things year to year within the data that we help clients at least think about, make decisions on, and be intentional about. It's one thing. So, sometimes we'll engage with new clients and this is their approach, and we start calling some of these things out, and they start to realize how their prior approach might have, created some inconsistencies and issues down the road.
Interesting. I just learned a lot right there. That was really informative.
Thank you.
Of course. I have a question for you. So you mentioned, and I follow the economy, and I'm always really interested what's going on from a macro perspective, from a global perspective. And one of the headlines in the news over the last few years, which has ultimately had a huge effect on biotech, is inflation. And I would have to imagine that there's some correlation between macroeconomic inflation and the cost of living and the cost of goods and compensation. Is that something that you analyze? Is that something that you take into consideration? I know you mentioned something about like 1.8 to 2% annually, but how does that factor in, or does it factor in to compensation?
Yeah, no, it definitely factors in. I mean, I don't think I've seen it have a significant impact in the US, other than I think 2022 was the year that I think it really set in, right? We were seeing 8 or 9% inflation. And, I started seeing people's merit, promotion, and adjustment budgets tick up to 4.5%, 5% merit increase or salary increase, right? I think that was the only year that we saw it. I don't think, you can't listen in the news and hear, hey, inflation's at 8% and expect that you're going to get an 8% increase, right? Because, every day you can listen to the Fed, what the changes that they're trying to do to reduce interest rates. And you never want to chase the inflation of where the data is. You want to make consistent, gradual changes to catch up to it, right? And so, I think people were at 4.5% that year to do that, because if inflation comes back down and all of a sudden comes back down to 2, okay, we just gave them 8, right? And so we're not taking it back, right? So you never want to go the full way. I think in general, the US has continued to tick up from a 3% standard increase to 3.5. Some clients went to 4. So I do think you see it in that way, but you don't see it like you see it in Argentina, right? Where they've got 25, 30% a year inflation. And each year you're increasing your compensation or base salary costs, relative to where the market is. It's certainly not to that extent. So, I think it plays a role into it. And I think it's a factor, but you're never going to keep pace with inflation, because if that ever dips back down, you then have overinflated base salary costs, which you don't want.
Yeah. On a related topic, what about real estate and cost of living? Like that's something, it's related, right? Like cost of living has gone up significantly in the Massachusetts area since COVID, and I think across the country. But how much of that is a factor into compensation? I mean, is it kind of the same the same line as inflation. You kind of look at it the same way, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if that's something you guys take into consideration.
So I don't think we necessarily take it into consideration directly, right? When I think about real estate and cost of living as to where you live, that generally flows through the market data that we get, right? If I pull market data for a biotech pharma company in San Francisco, it's going to be 10 to 15% more at least than what we may see in Pennsylvania or Boston. Okay. Same thing with New York. And, I think if you've got a larger population that's in a certain geography, you want to know what that geography is paying so that you're competitive to the local market, right? So I think real estate plays out based on the location cuts that we can get and we run for each client so that they fully understand what that is and where. And then once that you do that, San Francisco, now you're paying 15% more than you are throughout the rest of the country. Now you can argue, yeah, but San Francisco is more than 15% higher than Boston in real estate, which it might be. But again, you're never going to want to go the whole way. You're going to want to take a very kind of pragmatic methodology to get there.
Very interesting. All right. So biotech company starts up, say they have a Series A and they want to hire 50 people. And we'll call it a discovery phase company, right? They want to hire a lot of R&D scientists, and that's really the focus. And so when would they bring in, or when do they want to bring in typically comp information, comp structures, and what is the net benefit of having an expert like yourself at their disposal on hand when they're looking to do that initial 50 round of hiring?
I think it'd break it down into kind of two parts of the conversation. Number one, let's talk about kind of what they do, right? And then we'll kind of talk about, maybe what they should think about doing, right? I think when companies are that small, again, we talked about TA and recruiting, their first primary focus is to call you versus to call me, right? They're going to call you first to get to that 50 headcount. I think what I see small companies do, and you think of small companies that are, 5, 10, 15, 20 people, that is about as risky of a company as you can possibly join, right? That is the home run pitch in its entirety. And so they flex, in my opinion, any way that they can possibly flex to land talent, right? And so what do? They overinflate the job titles. They might overpay to land talent to bring them in versus where they maybe need to pay just to land the talent. And they'll do those things and it will work and it's going to attract the talent. The play is really on the equity side, right? But no one wants to take a base salary reduction. So they end up doubling up because they get the same at least base salary as where they were before with this big equity load and home run pitch if the company ultimately goes and does anything, right? Or makes it to the clinical trials. So that's what I think that they do. I think the challenges with that, right, especially on the scientific side, is, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people with principal scientist job titles. And I think you and I talked about this when we were talking last week, right? With 2 or 3 years of experience, right? There is no possible way that person is a principal scientist in the external market, right? But they do it, land the talent, person's a principal scientist, they feel good, they can tell their friends they're a principal scientist and everything's great. The problem is that once that they get to that 30, 35 person stage and they look to start to grow and scale, and they're actually looking to hire to meet their business objectives, true principal scientists or senior scientists, the folks that they're going to bring in are a very different breed and person than what they have, right? And so, again, you get into that situation where now people are joining your company, looking over it and saying, well, if that's a principal scientist, then I should be a senior principal scientist because I have got 5 more years of experience, right? And so there's an effort that I think when clients do reach out before they grow and scale, you really need to clean that up. And it's going to create difficult conversations. And, you can try to grandfather things or you can try to take some different approaches, which we work with clients through. But before you can really grow and scale and have the least amount of disruption and inequity as possible, it's really important to kind of clean up that early stage effort and then start to align again to that career framework that I discussed around principal scientist is someone with a PhD and 8 to 10 years of experience, right? And then when you do that, you can start to get into situations where you can start to have harmony within the comp structure and bringing people on board.
And you may have said this, but so are you saying it's best to get somebody involved as early as possible?
I think so. Yeah. No, I do. We generally don't hear from those small clients until they start to get to that ramp up stage around 20, 25 people. But, look, we've got clients that, honestly will pop in, may bill them $7,000 to $10,000 a year, right? For a little project here. Hey, Jason, give me some coaching or advice here. How do I eliminate this? How do I think about this? And just even having the foresight and the knowledge of what to expect down the road is really important for those companies, right? Things that they can do now so that when they do get to 35, 50 people, they're in a much better spot. It doesn't need to be a lot of lift. It doesn't need to be heavy work. But I think engaging with someone to know the impacts of the decisions you're making are very important, right? And then, again, out of the 40 clients, I think we've got probably 15 to 18 that we're active with each week, month to month, week to week, right? We've probably got another 10 to 12 that pop in for us to do their Radford submission, for us to get the market data and kind of reformat, refresh that. And then for the CHRO to reach out and say, hey, this is a tricky one. Or how should I think about this? Or can we model this out to see what the impact, right? So it's kind of a light touch. And then we've probably got another 10 to 12 folks that have either gotten acquired, gone out of business, or hired a total rewards director, right? But there's a lot of different flavors that I think we can play as an advisor or consultant just to make sure that you're intentional and clear on the decisions that you're making.
So to sum it up, what would you say, and there's a lot that you've shared that to me is clearly beneficial for any biotech or any company that's going to start hiring and growing. But if you were to really sum it up in one kind of pretty package, what would you say the net benefit is of having a comp expert on hand? Whether it's a consulting resource like yours, or whether it's an actual comp person, what would you say that the overall net benefit is?
Yeah, well, I know it sounds cliche, but you really are talking about your workforce, right? One of the most critical elements of your business, right? And I think, I always think, every decision I try to make is understanding the unintended consequences of decisions 2 or 3 years later, right? And so there's almost no decision that we can't collaborate to make or make an exception for, and that's fine, right? But what are the impacts of that 2 or 3 years down the road? And let's be eyes wide open and cognizant of that so we're aware, right? And a lot of times, I take an average open rec at the director level, right? And so what I try to help clients understand is, hey, look, if you've got a director level role and you've got 3 types of people you can bring into that role, right? You could go get an A+ associate director, right? And bring them into a new director level, a little bit below the market 50th. Have probably 2 or maybe 2 good years, 2 or 3 good years with them in that role, and then another 2 years with them at the senior director role, and we're great. You can bring in a director who has a year or 2 of experience in that, doing that work, where you probably have 2 years, 1 to 2 years of them being in that role before they're looking for a promotion. And then the third option is you can bring in a senior director to do a director level work. And the challenges with that is that they're a little bit less engaged because they've already done that work. They're probably happy about the company because they made the decision to come. But as soon as they come on board, 6 to 9 months down the road, they want to be promoted to senior director again. And now you've got an issue where you've got a person that, is probably doing really well in exceeding. You don't want to make them happy, but you also don't want to use a promotion spot for someone that you just hired 6 months ago because you just made a bad hiring decision. I try to get people to think about, don't let one decision or even exception decision lead to 5 to 6 other bad decisions because of the decision you made. And so, if you bring one person in high and you consciously do it, that's fine. I support it. Let's go. Let's land the talent, right? But we can't then go back and bring up 5 other people to be in line with the person you brought in intentionally high, just to create internal parity. If you're going to make the decision, you got to own it.
Fair. Really interesting. I feel like we could talk about for a long time, especially with all the knowledge you have. But this was really helpful, enlightening to me. And I think that the listeners will take a lot out of this, especially since a lot of the people who probably listen to this are in recruiting and talent acquisition within biotech. Really beneficial. Anything else that you want to share that you think is important about your particular practice or just compensation in general as people are looking at this as a critical topic for their businesses?
Yeah, no, we talked about a lot of great stuff. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you. Nothing else stands out. I think always just being intentional, consistent methodologies, understanding the data, and having a vision of where you want to be today and where you see the company going, at least in the next 2 to 3 years, and making decisions to get there as effectively as you can.
Awesome. Jason, thank you for being a guest. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, same. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Talent Therapy with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes and is copywritten by Ronan Vance, LLC.